this is the side I'm going to go. The air in the balloon can make the balloon rise by changing the volume, but keeping the mass the same. So if you want to talk about how that's happening to your balloon, mass is staying the same, but the volume's changing, you can do that. Or you can do it this way. Here it says, explain how the air in the hot air balloon can make the balloon rise by changing the mass, but keeping the volume the same. So here are the right answers. So this balloon is rising. All I need to know to answer part A is, if it's rising, what's happening to density? Do dense things rise or do they sink? Well, blurt it out. Dense things sink. So if this is rise, it's not dense. So the answer to 2A is it's got to be getting less dense. Or the other way to say that is the density is decreasing. That would be fine. So in your video, when you're talking about why the balloon rises or why the balloon's starting to rise, it's because somehow this whole thing is becoming less dense. And there are different ways that it can happen. Number 2, if the volume's remaining the same, is the overall mass increasing or decreasing? And explain your reasoning. So from the density is crowdedness. I maybe should have put that first. Density is how crowded something is. If it's more crowded, it's more dense. If it's getting less dense, it's getting less crowded. So that's how I started my explanation. If it's getting less crowded and the size is the same, and I know that because it says volume is the same. If the size is the same, it must be losing stuff. So if you've got a house that is kind of crowded, kind of dense, and the size of the house doesn't change, the only way to make it less crowded is to get rid of some stuff. Maybe leave those in it and have the other stuff out here. So that's the answer to 2B. It's got to be losing mass, and that's making it less crowded because it's just as big as it was before. In C, why is the mass changing in this way? So you can't really get C right unless you got B right. So C is I'm trying to explain why it's losing mass. And here's my explanation. The air inside here, when you heat it up, does it get bigger or smaller? What happens to air when you heat it? Does it spread out or does it shrink? It spreads out. And if the size of this can't change, then the air can no longer fit, so it comes out the hole. So that's my answer. The air inside is expanding, but the balloon isn't growing, so the air can no longer fit. And that means some of the air comes out. I have a student in my 7-8 class who rode in a hot air balloon, and he said every time he says really hot, which I've never thought about before. I always think, oh, they're high up, I bet it's really cool up there. But when you turn this flame on and it heats up the air inside and it expands, you get this rush of hot air coming down and out. Longer fit. So it's losing mass because the air comes out the hole. And then the pressure part. How does the heating of the air change its pressure? So when you heat this air up, you get more pressure. The air pushes and presses against the side more. And a good explanation of that is I guess I should have said how and why, because some of you just said it increases it, which is true. You just didn't explain it, but I didn't really ask you to. So heating makes the air molecules move faster. So if you imagine the sides of the balloon like this, and you imagine an air molecule going over and hitting the side, it's going to hit it harder if it's moving faster. And it's going to move faster if it's hotter. So the hotter it is, the faster they move, the harder they hit and press against the inside. So that push is the pressure. And then finally, what role does the pressure play in the process of the balloon rising? So in this case, guess what pushes the air out of the balloon? Begins with a P. The pressure. The pressure is what you can think of the reason the air expands. It's pressing outward in all directions. It's pushing. And it can push against the side, but when it pushes against this hole, it just comes out. So what I said was the stronger air pressure causes air to push outward. The air near the hole pushes right out of the hole and leaves the balloon. So if it leaves the balloon, there's less stuff in it. If there's less stuff in it, it's less crowded. If it's less crowded, it's less dense. And if it's less dense, what does it do? What do not very dense things do? They rise. Yes. All right, so that's one way you can explain it. If you're watching your video and it looks to you like your balloon's not getting any bigger, you can use, let me get the screen going again. You can use all these answers to help you in your video. You can say, look at my balloon. The volume's not actually changing. What's happening is the air is expanding inside. It's pushing outward, increasing the pressure because the particles are moving faster, and that makes some of them come out. So there's less mass in there, so it's less dense, so it rises. Or you can do it this way. So this would be, what this one is saying is basically the balloon is like, like this. And then after a little while, after a little heating, it's like this. So it's actually growing. And it says we're changing the volume, but the mass is the same. All right. So number one, if the balloon's rising, what happens to the density? Well, the density is decreasing. That doesn't matter. Anytime something starts to rise and wasn't rising before, its density is decreasing. This is the same answer as before. What happens to the motion of the particles? They speed up. Heating speeds them up. So you turn on the flame, and the particles in here move around faster. How does the volume of the balloon change? Well, it already says the balloon's changing volume, but we have to, I guess you have to think about what would make this less dense. So if I have a house, the balloon is like a house, and it's got some mass in it. And I keep the same amount of mass because that's what it says here. The amount of mass doesn't change. What would make this house less crowded? To make it smaller or make it bigger? If I make it smaller, is that less crowded? That's more crowded. If I make it bigger, that's less crowded. So the volume increases. And then why does the volume increase? What makes it change? It's because the air molecules spread out as they get faster. So you heat them up, they spread out. You could also mention pressure at this point. When they speed up, they push outward with more pressure, so they spread. And heated air expands. Part D, if the overall mass is staying the same, what does that tell you about the air in the balloon? This was kind of, you're probably wondering, what does he mean? I said, what's the air doing or not doing? My answer, the answer I was looking for was no air is entering or leaving. The air is just staying in the balloon. So it's the same air, it's just expanding. If the mass were changing, if the mass were decreasing, air would be leaving. That's what we were saying was happening over here. And if the mass were increasing, then air would be added to it. But if the mass is the same, then the air is the same. E, explain why the density is changing and give an answer that shows you understand what density means. So somewhere in there, I'm looking for you to explain to me what density is. And that's what I did first. Density is crowdedness. So now I have to explain why the crowdedness is changing. And I've already explained this before. There's the same amount of air, but since it's more spread out, it's less crowded. So it's like this. The air is those 4 dots in here, but now the 4 dots are, one's here, one's here, one's here, and one's here. So they become less crowded as it gets bigger. How does heating the air change its pressure? Well, heating increases pressure, and then that's sort of a short answer. I could add because faster molecules push harder. If I wanted to explain why. And I think on the video you're going to have to explain why. And finally, what role does the pressure change play in the process of the balloon rising? It says stronger pressure pushes the sides outward, making the balloon expand. This makes it less crowded, less dense than the air around it, so it floats. So it goes from this. You heat these things up, the air particles push against the sides, that makes it bigger, then they're going to be less crowded in there, so it's less dense.